There is a story England has told about itself for over 1,000 years. It says that after Rome withdrew, a new people arrived, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, crossing the North Sea in open boats, and that these newcomers did not just conquer the island. They replaced its people, its language, its identity, almost entirely. For generations, that was treated less like a theory and more like a fact of birth. Then the genome started asking questions the old story could not answer. Surnames were supposed to be one of the last living fingerprints of that transformation. Names like Osgood, Wulfric-derived Woolridge, Aylward, or Godwin carry Old English roots stretching back before the Norman conquest. Names that sound, on the surface, like direct evidence of unbroken Anglo-Saxon descent. Somewhere along the way, genealogists and geneticists began asking whether these names actually meant what they seemed to mean. Whether carrying an Anglo-Saxon name meant carrying Anglo-Saxon DNA. The answer turned out to be far stranger and far more human than anyone expected. This is the story of what happened when researchers finally looked past the name and into the genome underneath it. To understand why this matters, you need the story most people already carry in their heads. Roman Britain collapsed in the early 5th century. Within a few generations, chroniclers and later historians described a wholesale replacement. Britons pushed to the western fringes, into Wales and Cornwall, while Angles and Saxons filled the lowlands of what would become England. The Old English language took root so completely that almost no Brittonic words survived into it. Place names shifted. Legal systems shifted. Even the origin myths of English kingship pointed east, across the sea, toward continental Germanic homelands. It was, by most tellings, one of the most complete cultural takeovers in European history. For a long time, that was treated as settled. Historians had the chronicles. Linguists had the vocabulary. Archaeologists had the grave goods, brooches, weapons, and burial styles that looked distinctly continental, distinctly Germanic, appearing across eastern and southern England almost overnight. The story had a shape: invasion, replacement, a new England built on the bones of the old. But there was a problem, and it had been quietly sitting in the ground the whole time. The problem was the skeletons. If the replacement had truly been as total as the old story implied, the biological signature should have been overwhelming and uniform. Instead, when researchers examined skeletal remains from early medieval English cemeteries, the picture was patchier than expected. Some individuals showed clear signs of recent continental ancestry. Others looked more consistent with populations that had already been living in Britain for generations. The material culture, the pottery, the brooches, the burial rites, spread far more uniformly than the bodies did. Objects moved faster than people. Something did not fit. That is where the first real friction begins. Not a contradiction, exactly, but a signal that the old story was too simple. Then came the tool that could finally test the bones against the story, the genome. When researchers began sequencing ancient DNA from early medieval burial sites across eastern England, they were not just counting artifacts anymore. They were reading two separate inherited archives at once: mitochondrial DNA, passed only through mothers, and Y-chromosome DNA, passed only through fathers, alongside broader autosomal DNA, which reflects ancestry from every branch of the family tree at once. Where these lines of evidence agree, the history is simple. Where they diverge, something more complicated happened on the ground, something no chronicle ever wrote down. And in early medieval England, they did not fully agree. The autosomal data showed that people in eastern England during this period did carry a substantial and genuinely new genetic contribution from continental northern Europe, consistent with real, large-scale migration from areas of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. That much supported the old story. But the proportions were not uniform, and they were not total. In many individuals, that continental ancestry sat alongside a persistent older layer, DNA consistent with populations who had already been in Britain for centuries, in some cases going back to the Iron Age. The newcomers had not erased the old population. They had mixed with it, unevenly, community by community. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. If you find this kind of detective work compelling, consider subscribing, because the evidence keeps rewriting maps that history had considered finished for centuries. Once researchers accepted that the picture was mixed rather than a clean replacement, they were left with a harder question. Mixed in what? Pattern? And why did some regions and some families end up with more continental ancestry than others? Several explanations emerged, and none of them could be dismissed outright. The first was straightforward regional variation in migration intensity. Some parts of eastern England may have received large, sustained waves of continental settlers, while other regions saw smaller, more diffuse arrivals that mixed more thoroughly with existing communities. The second was social stratification in mixing itself. The idea that continental ancestry may have concentrated more heavily among certain social classes or kin groups, meaning that two neighbors in the same village, one descended largely from newcomers and one largely from the older population, could have lived side by side for generations while sharing a language, a religion, and eventually a surname tradition, without sharing anything close to equal ancestry. The third, and perhaps the most unsettling for anyone chasing a surname back to a single heroic ancestor, was cultural absorption without full genetic replacement. The possibility that becoming English in the early medieval period was, for many families, primarily a matter of adopting a language, a legal identity, and eventually a naming tradition, layered on top of ancestry that remained largely, quietly pre-existing British. Each explanation implies a different family history hiding behind the same Old English surname. One is a story of continental descent. One is a story of regional patchwork. One is a story about how identity can be built through culture and choice as much as through blood. This is where the surname evidence becomes genuinely revealing. Names such as Osgood, Aylward, Goodrich, Wyman, Fairweather, Hardacre, and other rare survivals of Old English personal name compounds are not random. They preserve, almost intact, the naming conventions of the early medieval Germanic-speaking population of England. When genetic genealogists began recruiting men carrying these unusually old surnames and comparing their Y chromosome haplogroups to ancient early medieval samples, they were testing whether a name preserved through roughly 40 generations of father-to-son inheritance still carried a matching biological signal. The results were not uniform, and that inconsistency is itself the finding. Some men carrying deeply Anglo-Saxon surnames showed Y-DNA haplogroups strongly associated with the same Northern European lineages recovered from early medieval continental descended burials. A plausible, if never fully provable, unbroken paternal thread reaching back over 1,000 years. Others, carrying names of identical age and prestige, showed haplogroups far more common among the pre-existing population of Iron Age Britain, meaning that at some point, a break occurred. An adoption. Stepfather. An unrecorded shift no parish register could ever capture. Not every ancient name told the story its bearer expected. The landmark moment came when researchers assembled a much larger comparative panel, combining early medieval English genomes with Iron Age British samples, contemporary continental European genomes from the presumed homeland regions, and later medieval burials spanning several additional centuries. This was not a handful of graves anymore. It was a population-scale timeline, stretching from before the migrations to well after them. And what it revealed reordered the story once more. Rather than a single sharp genetic boundary at the fall of Rome, the data showed a gradual, uneven blending that continued for generations, with continental ancestry proportions varying enormously not just by region but even within single cemeteries, sometimes between individuals buried within feet of each other. The clearest genetic transition was not a moment. It was a process, slower, messier, and far less complete than the old invasion narrative had ever allowed. Not the clean replacement historians once described. Not even a single migration event, but several, layered across generations. The twist was not that continental ancestry arrived. The evidence for that is real and well supported. The twist was how partial, patchy, and socially uneven that arrival turned out to be, and how much of what came to be called Englishness was built, generation after generation, from a population that was never as replaced as its own foundation myth insisted. The genome was not erasing the old story of Anglo-Saxon England. It was revealing an older, more tangled population beneath it, one where newcomers and natives were, from very early on, already becoming the same people. This matters far beyond England. It is tempting, looking at any nation, to imagine history as a clean relay race, one people handing the baton to the next, a fresh start at every conquest. DNA keeps showing that this is almost never how it actually happened. Populations are not pure streams flowing from a single source. They're deltas, dozens of tributaries merging and separating and merging again, long before anyone wrote a chronicle describing a single, tidy beginning. Picture the flat fenland of eastern England in the 6th century. Low mist over reed beds at dawn. Timber halls with smoke curling from thatched roofs. Two households a short walk apart, one speaking a newly dominant Germanic tongue with continental grandparents still remembered, the other descended from families who had farmed that same soil since long before Rome ever arrived, now learning the same language, marrying into the same families, burying their dead under the same style of grave goods. Within 2 or 3 generations, no one in either household could have told you, without a genome sequencer that would not exist for another 1500 years, which ancestry was which. They were already becoming one people. That is what an old surname can preserve. Not a pure bloodline. A memory, partial, occasionally mistaken, of a family choosing, generation after generation, to keep a name, a language, and a story that had grown larger than any single ancestor who first carried it. If a Y-DNA test tells someone their male line does not match the continental Germanic signature their 1,000-year-old surname implies, that does not make their English heritage less real. It makes it more honest. Identity was never only about an unbroken bloodline. It was about the choice, repeated across dozens of generations, to keep speaking the language, keep the name, and keep belonging to a story that had already absorbed far more people than it ever excluded. So when you look at a name like Osgood, or Wyman, or Fairweather, understand you are not looking at a fossil of pure Anglo-Saxon descent. You are looking at the visible edge of something much larger and mostly invisible, over 1,000 years of migration, intermarriage, quiet absorption, and reinvention, compressed into a handful of syllables a family decided, generation after generation, was worth keeping. The old story said the Anglo-Saxons came, conquered, and became England. The genome agrees with part of that story, and then quietly insists it was never that complete. The island was never emptied. The newcomers were never as separate as the chronicles implied. And the names that survived are not proof of purity. They are proof of persistence, of a story that kept absorbing new threads for centuries and never stopped being rewritten. If stories like this interest you, where a single surname or a single strand of DNA turns out to hold 1,000 years of hidden history, subscribe, because the human past is far more layered than any family tree has ever managed to show. The map of English ancestry was never finished. It still isn't. And perhaps that is the truest thing DNA has ever revealed about any people. The origin story is never really an ending. It is only the oldest layer we have managed to find so far.